your Bibles, we invite you to turn to the book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk chapter 3. Habakkuk chapter 3. As you make your way there, we'll go to the Lord in prayer. Dear God, we come to you today. We're so thankful for the many blessings that you've given us, for allowing us the opportunity to gather and to sing your praises, to look into your word. And please help us as we would do such. We'd be considerate of what it is that we're doing, of who it is that we're reading of, but also that we would gain an understanding of the facts of your word. That it's not just some collection of old stories. It's not just some collection of old lessons learned. But it's just real events of a real God who offers a real salvation to his people, who has a real power, a real sovereignty, and a real love, real mercy, and real wrath, God, that we could understand just the legitimacy of your word and actually put faith to action. Really, that's what faith would produce. That where there is no faith, there's no action, and where there's no action, there's certainly no faith. God, please help us that we could have the type of faith that would mold us and prod us and push us to act as though we believe what we say we believe, to find comfort when there's no comfort to be found, to have a diligence and an urgency about your work when it seems that the rest of the world has no care and is, I guess, apathetic towards the message of the gospel. Please help us to be very fervent and very faithful to spread that message. If there be one here that's lost today, we ask that you would once again help them to see a need for a Savior, that they could learn to trust you before it would be too late. Please help me again as I stand, as always. I certainly have no ability and no sufficiency. I've got no knowledge and no wisdom. But your Holy Spirit is perfect, and I ask that your Holy Spirit would be used to relay your message and not my own. That it would fall on ears that are eager to listen, eager to grow in accordance to your word. In your wonderful holy name, we pray for you so worthy. Amen. Habakkuk chapter 3 will begin in verse 7. Don't be shocked when we read a little further than we normally do. We're not going to finish, but we'll cover a little more than what we have been. Saw the tents of Cushan in affliction, and the curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. Was the Lord displeased against the rivers? Was thine anger against the rivers? Was thy wrath against the sea? Thou didst ride upon thine horses and thy chariots of salvation. Thy bow was made quite naked, according to the oaths of the tribes, even thy word, Selah. Thou didst cleave the earth with rivers. The mountains saw thee, and they trembled. The overflowing of the water passed by. The deep uttered his voice, and lifted his hands on high. The sun and moon stood still in their habitation, and the light of thine arrows they went, and the shining of thy glittering spear. Thou didst march through the land in indignation. Thou didst thresh the heathen in anger. Thou wentest forth for the salvation of thy people, even for salvation with thine anointed. Thou woundest the head out of the house of the wicked, by discovering the foundation unto the neck, Selah. Thou didst strike through with his staves the head of the villages. They came out as a whirlwind to scatter me. The rejoicing was as to devour the poor secretly. Thou didst walk through the sea with thine horses, through the heap of great waters. We'll stop here. This would conclude this prayer from Habakkuk that is labeled as a theophany, as this description of seeing God. And we come to the conclusion in verse 15. And if you recall, in the first few verses, we looked at God's faithfulness. We saw that his faithfulness right out the gate. Well, I guess first, before the theophany started, we saw his tone change. We saw Habakkuk have a new sense of humility before God. And then in verse 3, he went and spoke of the foundations of God calling his people out of Israel and how that he was faithful to do that. And then we switched and we started to look at not just the faithfulness of God, but the glory of God and the holiness of God. And that would be where we looked in verse 4, speaking of his brightness being as the light, and in verse 5, that we saw his power displayed, that pestilence went before him, burning coals went at his feet. And in verse 6, he stood and measured the earth. We talked about the control that he has, and his glory and his holiness. And so now we move from his glory kind of almost back to his faithfulness, but really specifically in the form of his providence and how he has provided for his own people. And as Habakkuk, as he sits in history, where he does, he had a lot of things to draw from. He had a lot of things written down previously that he could dwell on, that he could praise God for. He could go, he had a lot of works written before him, thankfully, and he could go back to the Pentateuch, and he could look through Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and see God's faithfulness towards his people and calling them out. He could look at Abraham and the covenant given to him, and he could look at how God brought them out of Egypt and cared for them in the promised land. And he could go back to the period of the judges, and he could see how God would provide a judge to deliver his people. And he can go through the history and see the miracles that God had worked to provide for his people. And he could look back on these things and find something to rest in, find something to put faith in, and thank God that he did. It is very wonderful that as this man who was so overcome and so struggled at the beginning of the book, that he begins to look back on God's faithfulness and God's providence and begins to learn and begins to find something to put trust in, to see a God of action, not just a God of thought. And he starts in verse 7. As all the tents of Cushan in affliction and the curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. This would be the inhabitants of the land of Canaan. That as Habakkuk is writing and speaking of God, that he looks back to those people that were in the promised land before Israel went in. And he saw their reaction. Now, we're going to go take a look at their reaction, but before we do, let's go to Numbers 13. Numbers 13. First, I'd like for us to see why the Canaanites had the reaction they did before God's people. Book of Numbers 13. Now the Israelites, they weren't impressive. They weren't mighty, savage warriors. They weren't giants. They weren't powerful. They were nomads. They were people that roamed. They didn't even have cities. They just walked around as a group of folks. And we're going to find an astounding reaction and fear of this people. But before we look at that reaction, let's take a look at the people. In Numbers 13, this would be as they were fixing to go in to the promised land in verse 26. It says, and they went and came to Moses and to Aaron and to all the congregation of the children of Israel into the wilderness of Paran to Kadesh, and brought back word unto them and unto all the congregation, and showed them the fruit of the land. And they told him and said, we came into the land whither thou sentest us, and surely it floweth with milk and honey, and this is the fruit of it. Nevertheless, the people be strong that dwell in the land, and the cities are walled, and very great. And moreover, we saw the children of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the south, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and by the coast of Jordan. This is the people's reaction. And thankfully in verse 30, and Caleb stilled the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and possess it, for we are well able to overcome it. But the men that went up with him said, we be not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. And they brought up an evil report of the land, which they had searched unto the children of Israel, saying, the land through which we have gone to search it is a land that eateth up the inhabitants thereof. And the people that we saw in it are men of great stature. And there we saw the giants and the sons of Anak, which come of the giants. And we were in their own sight as grasshoppers. And so we were in their sight. Now we would know the rest of the story. They'd be forced to go and travel for 40 years through the wilderness. That they would be judged because they provoked God to wrath, because they had no faith. And they would go out and wander for 40 years. But this report, that we have these people that have experienced the mighty providence of God. They walked and as a lot of folks say, kicked up a dust cloud through the Red Sea, and they would drink water out of a rock, and they would, in the morning, wake up and eat bread off the ground, and then they would send these spies in and come back with this awful report. These spies would come back. It says that they brought a cluster of grapes, and 2 people had to carry it between a pole. This was how fruitful the land was. And they said, surely the land floweth with milk and honey, as we've heard. Here's the fruit of it. And 2 folks walking with a cluster of grapes. And yet they said the people of the land are too mighty. So we're as grasshoppers before them. This is the stage. This is as we look at whenever they would go into battle, this is what we have: a group of grasshoppers, just a small, insignificant group of folks going up to fight against large, literal giants. Now let's go to the book of Joshua, chapter 2. And in our minds, as these people would see these nobodies walking up to their fortified cities, well defended, well established, with mighty armies, we think they'd laugh and scoff and have a good time. This wasn't the case. In Joshua chapter 2, verse 9, and she said, and this is Rahab, it says, and she said unto the men, I know that the Lord hath given you the land, and that your terror is fallen upon us. So we read that and we say, okay, so Rahab thought a little better. Not just Rahab, and that all the inhabitants of the land faint because of you, Israelites. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did unto the 2 kings of the Amorites that were on the other side of Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom ye utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts did melt. Neither did there remain any more courage in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and in earth beneath. This is astounding. I want us to notice something. This is over 40 years after the spies gave the evil report. There's been some time to pass in here. And now the things that Rahab mentions are things that happened before that. That the Lord dried up the Red Sea for them to pass through and drown the armies behind them before they provoked God. They went to war with the 2 kings of the Amorites before, when Moses would hold his arms up. And then they would go to take the land and say, no, we can't do it. And then they would travel for 40 years, and then they would come back and they would say, and they would go into Jericho. And as they got to Jericho, the whole city shut down. Nobody went in, nobody left. And a resident of Jericho would stand and risk her life to save some spies because they heard of what the Lord did over 40 years ago for these people. And it says that as soon as we heard these things, our hearts didn't melt. Neither did there remain any more courage in man because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and in earth beneath. This is 40 years later, and meanwhile, 40 years before this, God's own people didn't have enough faith to make the same statement. They didn't have a high enough view of their own God to have confidence. This God who did these acts over 40 years before this sucked every bit of confidence out of this massive, well-fortified city. And His own people rolled around in self-pity. His own people saw no value, no ability, no power, and had no faith. And as Habakkuk would write of these things, of the inhabitants of the land, I can't help but think that Habakkuk would think of his very own kinsmen. That he would think back to the fact that at that moment, that literal pagans had more faith in their God than God's own people did. Literal pagans dwelling in Jericho had a higher view of God than what Habakkuk had. And that had to have been a little convicting, to have to write these things that they could see so clearly. The Lord your God fights for you. And they had no confidence in themselves as an outsider. And yet His own people could not. What we're getting at is God is a God of providence. It is a God that you can rest your trust in. That His enemies had more fear of Him than His own people. These things ought not to be. It ought to be that we have as high a view of God, that their lack of confidence, and to the extreme that they lacked confidence, that they shut down the city They trembled, they fretted, they thought, oh no, what shall we do? We ought to have as strong of a reaction in the other way. We ought to have the reaction to say, that's how you ought to react before my God. That is the fear you ought to have before him, because he's a mighty God and he's able to provide. He's able to overcome. He's able to do these things. And Habakkuk's getting around to the point where he can realize this. He moves on from these people and he looks to the continual judgment of God. In verse 9 of Habakkuk 3, say, thy bow was made quite naked according to the oaths of the tribes, even thy word. And in verse 12, thou didst march through the land in indignation, thou didst thresh the heathen in anger. This bow of God's wrath, as it speaks of in verse 9, thy bow was made quite naked. This bow is used in the Old Testament as a symbol of war. And Habakkuk, you've got to understand or remember that they are facing war. They're looking at war coming. That Habakkuk is looking at these Babylonians come to provide war. He's reminded that my God is a God of war. He's not just some mamby-pamby God. He's a God who has proven himself through the Israelites that he is able to win war. He is able to cast judgment on people. And as he has promised that, yes, the Babylonians would come and cast judgment and destroy Israel, that there would be a remnant left and that Babylon would receive the judgment. And God is able to dish that judgment out. He's done it in the past. He's provided in the past. He says that his bow was made quite naked. His bow was made obvious. According to the oaths of the tribes, even thy word. It was well accounted of. It was well recorded. Habakkuk could go back and read the very things that God did and the very ways that he has provided through battle. The very ways that he has overcome enemy time and again. He could think back, as we've already mentioned, to Egypt. He could think back, as we've mentioned, to those Canaanites. And he could think back to the times that Joshua was in battle specifically. And Jericho, how that God provided in quite an odd way that they'd walk around the city. He could think of how they would go after that to Ai and be destroyed because of their sin. And they would remove the sin from the camp, as it would say, and then go back and utterly destroy them. And then how they would be fighting several kings. And he actually references this in verse 11, when he said that in a moment. And how that God stopped the sun and the moon that they could overcome them. And he could think back at the time that they went with some jars and lanterns and trumpets and everybody just fought themselves, and they really didn't even have to get their hands dirty. And he could think back to this God who has cast his judgment out and say, well, if he's done it in the past, he's promised to do it again in the future. I don't see why he can't. I don't see why he can't judge the Babylonians later on if he said he would do it. And for us today, there's a future Babylon coming. There's a future world system coming that will utterly despise God, and he's able to overcome that one too. He's already promised that he would overcome that one as well. We've got no reason to think he can't. He has a proven track record of doing these things. And sure, these Babylonians were ruthless. Sure, there was a lot to fear, but guess what? God is more powerful. He is able to reciprocate, not just in evil, but in judgment. Again, verse 12. Thou didst march through the land in indignation. Thou didst thresh the heathen in anger. Verse 14. Thou didst strike through with his staves the head of his villages. They came out as a whirlwind to scatter me. Their rejoicing was as to devour the poor secretly. That's pretty harsh stuff, to thresh the heathen in anger. God is able to overcome even just the most vile of enemies with his sovereign judgment. And again, he's done it already. There's written accounts of it happening, and Habakkuk must say, you've done it in the past. I don't see why you can't do it again. And then we have, once again, his power over creation being brought out here in Habakkuk. We can see it in verse 10. The mountains saw thee, and they trembled. The overflowing of the water passed by. The deep uttered his voice and lifted up his head on high. And we see this, I say again, because in verse 6 it has something similar to say that the everlasting mountains were scattered. The perpetual hills did bow. His ways are everlasting. We see it in verse 11. The sun and the moon stood still in their habitation. At the light of thine arrows they went, and at the shining of thy glittering spear. We see that God is not as limited as we like to limit him. He's not as small as we like to think of him. In Joshua 10, that is so astounding. Again, we look back to these things that we learn in Sunday school as just a bunch of old stories. But I mean, that Joshua would literally lead his people in battle, and they would be winning easily. And they're running out of daylight. And Joshua says, "Sun, stand now still." And it stands still for about another day. You got a whole extra day out of it. It wasn't Joshua. Joshua didn't stop the sun. It was the God that they served. That he was able to do just the wildest things. I mean, we read these stories. We say, wow, that's pretty cool. Yeah, of course, that makes sense. God created everything, sure. And we go away unfazed by how miraculous these things are. Recall the reaction that the disciples had on the boat. That they would finally, the storm would come up and Jesus would be asleep in the ship. And they would wake him up and say, "Master, carest thou not that we perish?" And he would rise up and say, "Wind, be still," or "Peace, be still." And it says that the storm stopped. The water was smooth. Everything was fine. What was their reaction? "What manner of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" They were floored. That stuff doesn't happen. Nature is something that we can't control. Nature is something we have no ability to do anything about. You go outside and try to stop the sun from moving. It's not going to work. Go outside and for the sake of all of us, try to make it a little cooler. You're not going to accomplish it. You go out whenever it's raining and lightning, and you say, "Rain, rain, go away," and you sing your little song and see what happens. Nothing. And yet we read in God's word of him doing these things and say, "Well, yeah, that makes sense, fine." We're just unfazed by these things. That's a powerful God. And that's the God that is our God. That is the God that has promised some eternal promises to us. That is the God that has promised deliverance to us. And I bring this up because we live in a world that is so discouraging. We live in a world that has such a hatred towards God. And our default position is, well, oh well. I hate that for the world needs to get right. If they'd get right, we'd be a whole lot better off. And then we just pout about it. The world's going to hate us. The world's going to despise the message. There's no reason to pout about it. That's all the more reason to get the message to the world. I'm not saying that the world's going to go and change overnight. I'm not even saying the world's going to change before Christ returns. We don't understand the world's going to get far worse before it gets any better. There's coming a day that it's changing. There's coming a day that these things are over. We ought to be preparing for that day. We have a God that is able to bring it to pass. Habakkuk stood, and Habakkuk is recalling these things. Habakkuk couldn't say, well, praise be to God, he has all this control, so that means the Babylons aren't coming. No, the Babylons are coming. The destruction's still coming. But there's still comfort, because he knows that God's made a promise to his people, that God would judge the Babylonians, and that all would be well, that his throne would be established, that there would be peace, that his people would be, that God would be their God, and the people would be his people. And he could relax. He could find comfort in the face of a trial that we could never really wrap our minds around. It's quite a powerful God that we would serve. Why does he do this, though? What's the purpose? Verse 8. I love verse 8. He says, in Habakkuk 3, verse 8, "Was the Lord displeased against the rivers? Was thine anger against the rivers? Was thy wrath against the sea? Thou didst ride upon thine horses and thy chariots of salvation." This really points back to some more of those astounding miracles, the parting of the Red Sea, the parting of the Jordan River. And Habakkuk asks this question, was your wrath against the sea that you parted it? Or against the rivers that you parted it? No. God didn't do it because he was mad at some water. He didn't do it because he was bored and had nothing better going on. He didn't do it to try to prove some point or to keep himself entertained. He did it, as verse 13 says, "Thou wentest forth for the salvation of thy people, even for the salvation with thine anointed." It wasn't arbitrary. God didn't arbitrarily decide to just show us how strong he was. It was for an end. It was for a point. What was the point? The salvation of his people. And so, once again, we look at this God that has done these mighty things, these incredible things with this awesome power and this awesome sovereignty, and we think that he wouldn't do it for us. We think that he would not provide for us. The only reason he provides is for us. The only reason he provides anything is for the salvation of his people, that he may receive honor and glory from it. It wasn't just this random showing. And as we come to chapter 3, it's almost as though we see a light bulb go off for Habakkuk. Again, I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but all he's doing is describing, in these verses, in 3 through 15, he's describing God. In chapter 1, Habakkuk describes God. In verse 12, "Art thou not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, thou hast ordained them for judgment, and Almighty God, thou hast established them for correction. Thou art of purer eyes than to behold evil, and canst not look on iniquity." He described God the exact same way he's describing him in chapter 3. What's the difference? There's a light bulb. We can literally just see the light bulb go off in Habakkuk's mind, where he says, oh, that's what that means. Oh, I can find comfort in that. This is what that looks like. Again, as we read in chapter 2, the just shall live by faith. We see the light bulb go off to where he begins to believe the things he said. He begins to believe these things that he brought before God in question. The light bulb would go off. What we find is that this is not some religion of thought. There are wonderful thoughts in God's Word. Wonderful philosophies. I'm not big into philosophy. But if anybody is big into philosophy, you really like philosophy, you study the philosophy of God's Word, it's second to none. It is truly astounding. You like history. The history of God's Word is incredible. You like logic. The logic of God's Word is the most logical thing ever written. The thoughts in God's Word are beautiful thoughts, but it's not just some school of thought. It's not just some book of ideas. It's a book of a God that moves and a God that acts. In chapter 1, Habakkuk had thoughts about God. Habakkuk could probably go on and describe holiness and describe righteousness and how it's seen in the law. And you have all these beautiful theological ideas. These things are good. These things are wonderful. But in chapter 3, he kind of understands it. He says, oh, this is more than just ideas. It's more than just truth. There's an action behind this. There's a God that moves behind this. We're going to go. We read these verses this morning, but I'd like to read them once again in Job 42. Job 42. Verse 1. Yeah, I know we read these verses this morning. But there's some very powerful verses. Verse 1. Actually, we're already here. Let's go to chapter 40. So we can see all of Job's response. I'll throw in something we didn't read this morning alongside Job 40. Verse 1. This would be, the Lord would spend a couple of chapters, again, showing Job his power. Verse 1, moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, shall he that contendeth with the Almighty instruct him? He that reproveth God, let him answer it. Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I'm vile. What shall I answer thee? I will lay mine hand upon my mouth. Once have I spoken, but I will not answer yet twice, but I will proceed no further. And then the Lord would continue on for the rest of chapter 40 and all of chapter 41. And we come to chapter 42, and Job answers again. In verse 1, then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that thou canst do everything, and that no thought can be withholden from thee. Who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge? Therefore have I uttered words that I have uttered that I understood not, things too wonderful for me, which I knew not. And again, God would say, Hear, I beseech thee, and I will speak. I will demand of thee, and declare thou unto me. I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now mine eye seeth thee. Wherefore I abhor myself, and repent in dust and ashes. There's a bit of a mystery with the book of Job, because it continually talks about how that Job didn't charge God. He didn't sin. And yet we have one of the harshest reprimandings in all of Scripture. We have just such belittling conversation that goes on here. And it was very needful for Job. Job didn't reject it. As a matter of fact, he repented and thanked God for it. But there's so much debate as to why God had this response. If Job did nothing wrong. And I wish I had a good answer for you. But there was something in Job's heart in which he knew truth. There was something. Job had an understanding of God far better than what we could ever realize. There are even understanding when the book of Job was written. The book of Job is the oldest book written. Now, it doesn't go, obviously, Genesis details things further back. Genesis would be written by Moses. And so far as we can tell, the book of Job is written before Moses was ever born. He didn't have Scripture. He didn't have, and the things that he writes of are crazy. It speaks of, I know that my Redeemer liveth. What Redeemer would he have been? He wouldn't have had the promises to Abraham, to look back on. He wouldn't have these prophecies written down of this Redeemer that was to come. He had an understanding of God that is astounding. And yet, he didn't understand him. Because I spoke of things I didn't understand. He knew truth. He knew he had a Redeemer, for instance. He knew, as we read this morning, that it was the right thing for him to trust in God, even if God were to slay him. He knew that to be true. But now he saw God. Now he saw and understanding. He saw a God that moved. He saw a God that had power, a God of action. And all of a sudden, he wasn't a God of thought anymore. He wasn't a God of these things I know. He was a God that I have seen. Habakkuk has this same reaction, that he's not this God of thought, but a God that moves for the salvation of his people. A God that has provided continually and would continue to provide. Let's go to Joshua right quick. And as you go through Scriptures, and as you see, for instance, in Joshua 10, we can understand that we have the same God. We give the Israelites a hard time. We look at the Israelites. I made a statement earlier about Habakkuk, that Habakkuk had to have thought back of the response that Rahab had, for instance, and realized that she had a little more faith than what Habakkuk had at the time. That he could look back at the response of the Canaanites, how they trembled before the people of God, and realize, well, I don't have that high of a view God. I don't have that high of a view of God myself. We give these people a hard time. How could they do the things that they did? Why were they so unfaithful? They had the Word. They had the providence. Look what God has done for them. We find in the New Testament, we're grafted in with these folks. We have the same God. What God has done for them, God has done for us. God has done this all for the working of the redemption of the world. He's moved. What he did for Joshua, he did for us. What he did for Israel, bringing them out of Egypt, he did for us, that we might have a Redeemer. What he did for them in judging them and drawing them back to himself through Habakkuk and Lamentations and Jeremiah, and what he's done in all of that, he's done for us. What he's done through the New Testament for the Jews, he's done for us, that the world might have a Redeemer. And so we can look back at these very real accounts and find a very good God that has continually provided and will for us too. Joshua 10, verse 11. And it came to pass as they fled from before Israel and were in the going down to Beth-horon, the Lord cast down great stones from heaven upon them to Azekah, and they died. There were more which died with hailstones than they which the children of Israel slew with the sword. Then spake Joshua to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel, and said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand thou still upon Gibeon, and thou moon in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stayed, until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Jasher? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven, and hasted not to go down about a whole day. Now, we've already referenced this. And what we have is the children of Israel, they're chasing down these people, and God causes huge hailstones to rain down on the enemy and kill more than what they slain with the sword. And then we have the whole ordeal where he says, Sun, stand thou still on Gibeon, and moon and Ajalon. Verse 14, and there was no day like that before it or after it, that the Lord hearkened unto the voice of man. For the Lord fought for Israel. The Lord fought for Israel. Why does he do these things? Why does he display his glory and his power? Because he fought for Israel. He fought for his people. The very same people that we are grafted into. The very same people that God worked to bring the redemption of the world. The very same people he didn't just provide for here, but over and over and over again. He fought for Israel, and he fights for us. Let's take a look at Exodus 15. Exodus 15. Exodus 15, verse 1. Then sang Moses, the children of Israel, this song unto the Lord, and spake, saying, I will sing unto the Lord, for he hath triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider hath he thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and song. He has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will prepare him an habitation, my father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his host have he cast into the sea. His chosen captains also are drowned in the Red Sea. The depths have covered them. They sank into the bottom as a stone. Thy right hand, O Lord, has become glorious in power. Thy right hand, O Lord, hath dashed in pieces the enemy. He in the greatness of thine in the greatness of thine excellency, thou hast overthrown them that rose up against thee. Thou sentest forth thy wrath, which consumed them as stubble. And for the sake of time, we won't go much further. But this chapter just is the Song of Moses. And after this, his sister Miriam would take the women and they would begin to dance and to sing of the deliverance that their God has brought them. And it's a very real deliverance. Verse 13, Thou in thy mercy hast led forth the people which thou hast redeemed. Thou hast guided them in thy strength into thy holy habitation. The people shall hear and be afraid. Sorrow shall take hold on the inhabitants of Palestina. We have just this wonderful display of God through the Red Sea. And this is a display. You notice I've mentioned the Red Sea, I don't know, probably 6 times just this afternoon, because it keeps coming up. It's in Habakkuk and it's in Exodus. And it's all through the Old Testament. This is like the one miracle they keep looking back on all the time, and that's for good reason. It is a picture-perfect representation of salvation as a whole. You have a group of slaves being chased down by their captors, being trapped, and on the other side, a massive sea. For those of you that don't know, us in our lost condition, there's a great sea separating us and God. There's a great sea that keeps us from Him. And we're stuck, and our sin is moving in to kill us. And there's no hope. You've got no ability to overcome it. But then all of a sudden, the Lord parts the sea, and He allows His people to cross over. And then the captors follow suit, and the Lord destroys them. Didn't just forgive them. It's not just that God forgives us of our sin, but He has destroyed sin. utterly. He's destroyed death and hell and the grave and offers a victory whenever we stood no chance at all. It is this Red Sea that keeps making its appearance continually to the Old Testament for this very reason. Turn with me to the book of Revelation 21. Other end of the Bible. Revelation 21. It says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away. There was no more sea. It was this sea that had separated us from God. As John wrote the book of Revelation, he did so in exile. And where he was, where we believe him to be exiled, where we believed him to have been exiled, there was the Aegean Sea, I think is what it's called. Couldn't pronounce it right to save my life, I'm sure. And it is believed that he is on this little old island looking out at the sea. And there are people that would speculate as he's writing these letters that he would be looking out at the sea that had separated him from those he loved dearly. And we know that John had a dear love for the churches, as we actually just looked at Wednesday night in the book of 1 John. He had that plea with them in chapter 2, my little children. A love for the body, a love for the churches. And he begins to write these letters to the churches in the book of Revelation with a great concern for them. And there was this separation between the two. And as John would have this revelation that as we would get to heaven, he says, and there is no more sea. There's nothing else to separate. There's nothing that separates us from God. There's nothing that separates us from one another. There is nothing, no trials, no disagreements, no silly arguments, no sin, no physical barriers. We would all be with one another for all of eternity in perfect unity with our wonderful God. And the only reason that is so is because God moves. It's because God is a God of action. He's a God of providence. And He has provided for His people in the past. We can rest assured He will provide for us in the future. What does this providence look like? In verse 2. Now John saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. I heard a great voice out of the heavens saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and He will dwell with them, and they shall be His people, and God Himself shall be with them and be their God. God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. There shall no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain. This is the greatest line in all of Scripture. For the former things are passed away. And He that sat upon the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. He said unto me, Write. These words are true and faithful. The former things gone. The sorrow and the pain gone. Because God is a God of action. Our separation from loved ones on this life, gone. Our petty arguments that destroy, that separate, gone. All of it gone. There's no more sea. There's nothing to separate. And this God of action, this God of providence, He will continue to provide. Not just in this day, but until we get there. As we've looked through this chapter, we're fixing to get into, in my opinion, the best part of Habakkuk and close it out. But as Habakkuk has this light bulb, he comes to realize that this God I've already described, this God I knew, this God I knew truths of from His Word that I knew, that I've known my whole life, something flipped. And he realized that God is faithful. God is holy and glorious. And God provides. It's the God of action, not just of head knowledge. And should we learn to look at God this way, things get way better. Things are way more productive. We are a far healthier church, far healthier saints that is much more available to be used of God. And so Habakkuk learned these things. Again, next week we get to those things, or the next couple weeks. I don't want to make a promise that it'll be just next week. The next couple weeks. We'll take a look at how that Habakkuk is able to just worship even though he has absolutely nothing. And this is why. He has a new view of God. Not just a head view, not just a list of things he knows of God, but a list of things he has experienced of God. An understanding of what he knew. because the just shall live by faith. And until you have faith in what you know, you'll be stuck in chapter 1. You'll never get to chapter 3. You certainly don't want this to be the case. This will be the message. Well, for verse of invitation.